volunteering to do our first ever remote one. So Dillon got his undergraduate in meteorology from Texas A&M in 2014, and then he went to Scripps for his PhD, where he worked with Shangpeng Xie and Art Miller with a focus on various aspects of tropical extratropical interactions. He's now a series fellow, but he can often be found up at the Mesa Lab in the CAS visitor space as well. So there should be plenty of time to chat with him when we're able to go back to work once this pandemic is over. So today I think he's going to talk primarily on his PhD work and maybe some newer things, looking at aspects of extratropical tropical climate interactions. So if you have any questions, clarification questions during the seminar, maybe raise your hand and I will unmute you and interrupt Dillon. Otherwise, we'll leave questions till the end and then raise your hand then as well, and we'll take them in order. So I'll leave it to Dillon.
Awesome, thank you, Isla. And thanks everybody for logging on. Obviously this is a unique situation. Hopefully all the technical hiccups have been fixed and we're good to go. I'll do my best to keep my internet going throughout all of this, but if I drop out, I promise I'll sign right back in. So yeah, as Isla said, I'm a new postdoc at Series at the University of Colorado with primarily working with Chris Kanauskas, but Clara Desser has also sort of adopted me in her group in CAS. So as Isla mentioned, I'm around NCAR a lot when NCAR is open. So I'm looking forward to meeting a lot of you and hopefully discussing research with y'all and collaborating moving forward. But today, I want to talk a little bit about, well, I guess a lot about what I've done as part of my PhD work, and then hopefully, if we have time, I'd like to talk about some of the stuff that I've been doing as part of my postdoc. And to sort of motivate what I've been doing in the past and also what I'm looking to do in the future, I sort of want to zoom out for a second and discuss sort of broadly how the vast majority of research has sort of looked at this problem of extratropical-tropical interactions. And the way they've done that historically, and I'm trying to advance my slides. Let's see, maybe if I click, how's that? There we go, okay. So the vast majority of papers that have looked at this sort of topic have primarily been focused on, well, what's governing the position of the mean ITCZ, which you can see pictured here, and what sort of like high latitude climate perturbations influences where the ITCZ will be in sort of this equilibrium climate state. And so let's just very briefly talk about sort of this ITCZ sort of zonal mean perspective. We can collapse the atmospheric circulation into this sort of zonal mean view, and when we do this, we can see these broad Hadley cell circulations that exist in both hemispheres, where the surface trade winds converge at the surface, and that gives you moist convection near the equator in the form of the ITCZ, which is the upward branches of both of those Hadley cells. And this sort of precipitation centroid can be marked where the ITCZ is in the zonal mean. And if we think about what the atmosphere is doing when it creates these circulations, its primary goal is to transport energy. It's trying to smooth energy gradients throughout the climate system. So we can quantify energy through this sort of bracketed VH bar term, which will be vertically integrated zonal mean meridional moist static energy transport in the atmosphere. And in the atmosphere, moist static energy increases with height. So if we think about the direction and sign of moist static energy transport in the atmosphere, it's going to be positive in the northern hemisphere and negative in the southern hemisphere in the same direction as the poleward branches of the two Hadley cells. And I'm really just speaking within about 30 south and 30 north of the equator. And the ITCZ in sort of this zonal mean framework can be found where the moist static energy transport, meridional moist static energy transport is 0 in this case. So that precipitation centroid can be found where this is 0. But even this picture is a little bit too simplistic, because in this picture, the ITCZ is sitting directly on the equator. And we know that in the real world, that's not necessarily the case. So let's simplify even further, and we'll put the ITCZ in a more realistic setting. In this case, we'll represent our ITCZ by this sort of vertical line here going out into our atmosphere. And we'll push it just a little bit further north of the equator. And now when we do that, we can see that our equator, as we sort of extend it out into space, sort of crosses our upward branch of the Hadley cell in the southern hemisphere. So really the cross-equatorial atmospheric energy transport is negative here. So our atmosphere in the real world, in the annual mean sense, is transporting energy from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, because in the annual mean, the southern hemisphere is colder in this case. And so this leads to this sort of zonal mean ITCZ theory, that the position of the ITCZ is roughly proportional to the negative of the cross-equatorial atmospheric energy transport. And this works pretty well. If you look at observations or in long climate model simulations, and you look at the sort of the position of the ITCZ relative to the equator, and you compare it to cross-equatorial atmospheric energy transport, you can see that they're well negatively correlated, something like -0.5. So this has been one classic way to sort of define what's going on with the ITCZ, and it's really useful. You can think about it sort of in a paleo sense. Let's say that we just dropped a massive energy perturbation on to say the high northern latitude. Let's just say we had an ice sheet during the last glacial maximum, for example, and specifically when I do this in this sort of cartoon sense, I'm sort of thinking about the albedo effect on the climate system, and not the mechanical forcing of having a 3-kilometer ice sheet, but really just having something large and shiny in the northern hemisphere that cools the entire northern hemisphere. So if this were to happen, the atmosphere wants to adjust to this, and it wants to transport energy from the colder hemisphere to the warmer hemisphere. And so what's going to happen is that the ITCZ will shift southward, and our cross-equatorial energy transport is actually going from this warmer hemisphere to the colder hemisphere in this case. So this is just a really nice universal way to sort of think about these large-scale atmospheric energy transports. And now we know, so we've sort of established this in the last maybe 15 odd years, and more recently we've been zooming out even further and trying to understand how ocean transport modulates this atmospheric response. So this has sort of led to this so-called sticky ITCZ paradigm, where the Ekman response to this atmospheric circulation shift, if you will, provides oceanic energy transport that is in the same direction as the atmospheric transport. And because of that, the atmosphere actually doesn't end up having to work as hard to smooth energy gradients, because the ocean is compensating for some of that. So ultimately what happens is that the ITCZ just doesn't shift as far for a given atmospheric, it doesn't shift as far for a given energy perturbation in the real world, because we have the ocean that compensates for some of that. And so this is just, again, just a very broad overview of a very diverse and vast array of literature that I find really useful to sort of understand these large-scale energetic perturbations. Ultimately, what I'm going to be talking about today is not strictly related to this, but I find it really useful to sort of motivate this idea that we need to move beyond this zonal mean perspective. As I said, the vast majority of the literature that has thought about these high latitude impacts on tropical precipitation, tropical wind, and to some extent tropical temperature have primarily been focused on this zonal mean view, because it simplifies the problem really well, right? It collapses the dynamics, and it closes energy budgets better. It's a simpler way to look at things, but we don't look at the zonal mean because we find it particularly useful for the real world. We look at it because it helps us inform our understanding, but we don't live in the zonal mean, right? So part of what motivates my research, both as part of my PhD and looking forward as part of my postdoc, is to sort of look at these regional mechanisms for driving these high latitude signals down into the deep tropics, where they can satisfy in the zonal mean this sort of large scale energetics framework. So to do that today, I'm going to spend almost all the talk today will be focused on my PhD work, which was part of analyzing part of the simulation, which ended up being a North Pacific pacemaker experiment. And I'll dive into this in much more detail to explain everything that's going on. But I'm hoping that at the end, if I have some time, I'll show some preliminary results analyzing a different set of simulations that also look at sort of regional mechanisms for high latitude forcing. So with that, I'll just dive right into sort of this first topic, this first set of simulations, and explain one array of literature that has historically looked at regional mechanisms for high latitude to tropical forcing. And when I say high latitude, I just mean outside of the tropics. I don't mean like Arctic necessarily. I do mean sort of mid latitude. to extratropical to tropical interactions. And one set of literature that has focused on this for a long time, whether they recognized it or not, or whether that was their purpose, was this group of people that were thinking about meridional modes, these modes of climate variability that can be found in the tropical Atlantic and the tropical Pacific, and to some extent within the tropical Indian Ocean. And these meridional modes are modes of climate variability, modes of coupled climate variability between SST and surface winds primarily, but also to some extent precipitation. And they act as pathways. They act as regional pathways for random atmospheric variability from the extratropics to make their way into the deep tropics and influence all sorts of climate variability, including winds along the equator, SST, things like INSO will be the big focus for today, as well as rainfall within the tropics. And this can be one powerful regional pathway for these sort of extratropical signals to get to the deep tropics. And primarily when we think about meridional modes, and I will mention that I'll be mostly speaking about the PMM today, the Pacific component of this. The high latitude forcing in this case isn't necessarily energy perturbations. It's really the high latitude forcing is this sort of stochastic atmospheric variability that's happening in a transient sense in the North Pacific, and it can make its way into the deep tropics and trigger all sorts of interesting air-sea interactions. That being said, the atmospheric circulation that we're going to be talking about, this North Pacific oscillation, can in theory be triggered by sort of thermodynamic anomalies at high latitudes, and that's sort of a talk or discussion for another day. But if anybody's interested, maybe we can talk about it at the end. But generally speaking, a PMM event, this Pacific Meridional Mode event, is triggered in the winter time when the North Pacific oscillation is strongest. This is represented by the second EOF of North Pacific sea level pressure anomalies. And it's just represented by this dipole of sea level pressure anomalies. And so the idea here is that you have a large scale circulation in sort of the subtropical to mid-latitude North Pacific, and it can dip down into the deep tropics and influence the strength of the trade winds. So we can see that impact on the underlying ocean in this plot here. So these black contours are again the NPO, except it's a different phase than what's shown here. It's just the opposite phase. And the white contours here are Q flux, just showing you the direction of energy between the atmosphere and the ocean. And so basically what you can see here is that the southern lobe of the MPO here, if the circulation is going in this direction, it dips down into the deep tropics. It weakens, anomalously weakens the trade winds, which drives a turbulent heat flux into the ocean. And we can see that here, leaving an SST footprint in sort of the subtropical North Pacific. And this all happens sort of in the winter, early springtime, or it can happen in the winter and early springtime. But what you'll notice is that this Q flux doesn't extend all the way to the equator, right? These anomalies have not quite made it all the way down to the deep tropics where they can influence things like wind variability and SST along the equator. There needs to be more information here to sort of drive the teleconnection all the way from random atmospheric variability in the extratropics to sort of this deep tropical strip. And the way that this works is through something called wind evaporation SST feedback, or WES feedback. This is one of the primary ways by which these high latitude atmospheric, again, I say high latitude, but I really just mean extratropical atmospheric variability can make their way into the deep tropics and influence different parts of the climate system. And so this happens in sort of three processes, 3 steps. We can weaken the trade winds, which creates an SST anomaly footprint through turbulent heat fluxes, and that's through the MPO that I just showed. Eventually, these SST anomalies will grow strong enough that they can impact the atmosphere directly. And then once they're big, it generates all sorts of interesting air-sea interactions. And ultimately, it propagates the signal preferentially southwestward, ultimately getting it onto the equator, where it can influence wind variability. It can drive westerly wind events, which influence equatorial ocean dynamics and ultimately influence INSO, which is the main focus of this work. So I do want to illustrate that for you, sort of this idea of WES feedback, because it is important for the rest of my talk. So the idea, again, you have these trade winds, these mean trade winds in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. Let's just say that the MPO rolls through and we weaken the trade winds anomalously in the wintertime. We'll have some anomalous southwesterlies in the Northern Hemisphere. This will weaken the mean flow. You get a positive latent heat flux down into the ocean, and it creates a positive SST anomaly footprint that has not reached the deep tropics. Eventually this will get big enough, right? And it'll impact the atmosphere. It'll create a localized low pressure, and it'll suck in wind, suck in air from all directions. Particularly, it'll drive it across the equator, giving you this nice C-shaped bend in the wind field across the equator due to Coriolis. And it'll have impacts on the opposite hemisphere's wind field. So in this case, in the southern hemisphere, these surface wind anomalies will increase the strength of the trade winds, which will give you a cooling effect by increasing evaporation at the surface, and it'll give you a negative SST anomaly. So this is where meridional nodes really get their name. You get this meridional dipole in SST anomalies. And this is sort of one really important component of West feedback. There's sort of two main components that I really want to hammer home here. One, it can maintain a meridional SST gradient. So in sort of a quasi-equilibrium sense, if we go back and sort of think about our large-scale climate response to high latitude forcing, in the tropics, you can maintain a warmer northern hemisphere and a cooler southern hemisphere just through West feedback in a quasi-equilibrium sense, which is cool. And if we can get to the ET and MIP results, I'll show you some evidence of that. The second really important component of this is more of a transient response. This sort of drives the signal from the subtropics down onto the equator. And the way that happens is we consider the effect of these surface wind anomalies on the mean flow after the SST field has grown big enough to impact the atmosphere. So what happens is that on the southwestern portion of this SST anomaly, these surface wind anomalies are preferentially going to weaken the trade winds, whereas on the northeastern portion, you're actually preferentially strengthening the trade winds. So you end up with this sort of dipole of turbulent heat flux anomalies, where you reinforce the warmest SSTs on the southwestern portion, but you cool them or you damp them on the northeastern portion. And so the net result is that the whole thing is going to propagate southwestward. And I don't know if I can toggle back. Yeah, let's see if I can toggle back. So this whole thing will just propagate southwestward, and it'll sort of leave in its wake a dampened SST signal. So this is the transient teleconnection part that gets you that extratropical wind variability, teleconnecting its footprint basically down into the deep tropics, where it can influence all sorts of things. So you can quantify all of this using statistical methods. People often use these maximum covariance analyses. This is the first NCA of Pacific SSTs and surface winds. And you can see that the time series that explain this variability have all sorts of time scales involved. There's seasonal, interannual are the primary time scales, but decadal is also important on that people have argued that decadal variability is also important here. But what makes the PMM in particular really interesting is that it drives this wind variability around the date line. So you would think that it could be potentially important for driving El Nino or La Nina variability sort of in the following year. And if you look at a lag correlation analysis between INSO and the PMM, you can see that the PMM, the maximum correlation is when the PMM is leading by about 9 months. So that holds the idea that if you generate a PMM in, say, the winter of year 1, the PMM is going to peak, say, in the spring of that same year. And then in the following winter, you favor INSO conditions in this case. And so this is really exciting. This is a really interesting and useful tool that we are hoping to leverage, because if we think about when the PMM is peaking, it's peaking in the spring. If we look at sort of the monthly variance of SST in these time series, it peaks in the springtime. And historically, if we look at models and the way that they can predict INSO, this is just sort of a metric for different statistical or dynamical models and their ability to forecast INSO with different leads. We don't have great skill during the springtime, right? This idea of the spring predictability barrier. And so if we can leverage, if we can improve our understanding of the PMM-INSO relationship during this time of the year, potentially can enhance our prediction skill of these long leads, particularly during the spring predictability barrier. And so I want to talk this up because I do think it's important, but I also want to keep context that if we're looking at sort of this statistical relationship and observations, it's not a first order process, right? The PMM's influence on INSO is not a first order control on INSO variability, but it is important. This correlation is significant, and it's just adding more and more useful tools that we might be able to use to improve our predictability of INSO. So the goal, as part of my research for my PhD, was to quantify the importance of We say North Pacific SST variability, and what we're ultimately going to do is look at North Pacific SST variability. But keep in mind that in the subtropical North Pacific, most of that SST variability is driven by these changes in the wind. So really, we're trying to isolate the extratropical wind forcing on the SST field by forcing our models with that SST field, basically. So the way that we're going to do that is by running a North Pacific Pacemaker experiment, which we call NPOGA here, North Pacific Ocean Global Atmosphere. Basically what we do is we take GFDL CM 2.1, it's a 1 degree ocean, a 2 degree atmosphere, and we heavily restore SSTs north of this black line, about 15 degrees north. And we restore them back to observations, whereas everywhere else in the model is completely free to evolve and do whatever it wants. And it has a fully dynamical ocean. It can do whatever it wants. These pacemaker experiments have been used in a variety of different contexts in, say, the North Atlantic and also in the tropics, but this one is here is just for the North Pacific. So the way we can picture this is if we just take a point within our box and we compare the model to observations over time, then they're basically the same thing. So this just shows that the restoration is working. Whereas if you take a point outside the box that is in a region where you don't think the North Pacific is important for its variability, you wouldn't expect them to be correlated at all. And in this case, they're not. So if we do this enough times, in this case, we're going to do 10 ensemble members from 1950 to 2016. The ensemble mean will hopefully cancel all of the random internal variability between these ensemble members, assuming we have enough to span sort of the breadth of the internal variability. Then the ensemble mean should represent North Pacific SST forcing on the climate system. And the goal is to see how well we can reproduce the real world, just given information about the real world in the North Pacific. Sort of importantly, also to sort of isolate the impact of sort of local SSTs outside of our box on the wind field, we need to compare to an atmospheric only simulation where we don't have an ocean to sort of couple back to our wind field. So the way that we do that is we run an additional 10-member ensemble of atmosphere only runs, where we just take an atmospheric model, in this case, GFDL AM 2.1, and we force the exact same SSTs in the same domain in the North Pacific, whereas everywhere else is a seasonal cycle. So if we get any wind variability outside of our box, it's due to the winds that we prescribe within our box. And if we compare the winds between the coupled run and the uncoupled run, we can get a sense of how important things like air-sea feedbacks are within the tropics, things like Wes feedback, Bjerknes feedback, these sorts of things. All right, so just jumping right into the results here. The goal, again, is just to see right off how well can we reproduce observed INSO variability just given information from the North Pacific. So this is the red line here is observations. This is the NINA 3.4 index. The black is a control simulation that we've ran that has no information about the real world whatsoever. And obviously it's not correlated to the real world at all. And the question is, when we provide information from the North Pacific, how well do we get back the real world? In this case, this is the world with, in the ensemble mean of our pacemaker simulation. You can see that our correlation goes up to about 0.3, which again isn't super exciting, but I think there's a lot of neat information to sort of pull out here. And we'll look at sort of individual events a little bit later, but let's talk about the overall variability for a second. We can separate this, this variability into seasons to see how well we're reproducing INSO variability as a function of sort of lead time. And we can also look at different Nino indices to see if we have sort of a central versus Eastern Pacific INSO component here. And basically what you'll see is that we significantly reproduce the real world El Nino INSO variability in the fall and in the wintertime with peak correlations of about 0.4. And sort of looking at the Nino 3 versus Nino 4 region, sort of Eastern Pacific versus Central Pacific, you can see that we get a lot more of the variability for a lot longer in the Nino 4 region. So that sort of speaks to maybe to some degree speaks to INSO flavor preference for this sort of forcing. So we explained about 16% of the variance, and I would argue that's actually right about where we had hoped to go. If we go back and we look at our sort of lag correlation in the real world between the PMM and INSO, in the real world, the correlation is about 0.45 for this 9-month lead. So our simulations were never going to reproduce the world perfectly, because as I mentioned, this is not a first order process control on INSO. Our goal was to be able to reproduce a correlation something much closer to this, about 0.45. And we're doing that here. We get a correlation of about 0.4. So I think our model simulations in this sort of lagged sense are doing really well. So it seems clear that the coupled simulation has some skill at reproducing INSO in boreal fall and winter. So what evidence of these sort of PMM dynamics, what evidence of WES feedback do we have that sort of drive that teleconnection to the lower latitudes? The way that we're going to look at that is through this Havmuller diagram. This is as I said, a Havmuller diagram that shows the evolution of an average PMM event in the coupled model. And so it evolves in time on the y-axis, and it evolves in 2D space on the x-axis. So it's following this transect A here. So going from 0.0 to 0.6, 0.0 to 0.6, we're going from the northeast to southwest. The model is restored in this, just to the right of this vertical black line here in the northeastern subtropical Pacific. It's completely free to evolve outside of this, this dashed line here, and in between is a buffer zone. We have a linear drop off in our restoration rate. So the model is completely free to do whatever it wants over here, and it's constrained, at least the SST is constrained over here. And again, we're evolving in this northeast to southwest transect. And this is the average, I should mention, this is the average of 17 positive PMM events from 1950 to 2016, and this is across 10 members. So we have 170 independent samples here. So this is SST that I've plotted here. I'm going to add zonal surface wind anomalies, and then I'm going to add latent heat flux anomalies on top of that as well. So the colored contours are latent heat flux anomalies, where purple is ocean warming in this case. So purple is a positive latent heat flux. So this is a pretty messy graph, but I am going to step through it pretty carefully and just sort of focus to you what the most important features are. So for one thing, if we look at the evolution, it peaks, the PMM in this case is peaking in the springtime in the sort of the subtropical North Pacific. And about that time, we can see the sort of this tongue of positive latent heat flux anomalies and westerly zonal wind anomalies and positive SST anomalies begin to extend outside of our restoration region and propagate in time southwestward down closer to the equator, closer to that 0.6 here, right around the date line. And this is pretty indicative of WES-driven propagation that I showed in that cartoon schematic earlier. This idea that if you weaken the trade winds, you reduce evaporative cooling at the surface and you increase SSTs, and that whole thing is going to propagate southwestward. Eventually, once we get on the equator, these zonal wind anomalies start to grow slightly, and these SST anomalies definitely start to grow along the equator. So we can look at more of an equatorial Havmuller at this transect B. This is just going to be 3 south to 3 north average down here. And we can watch the evolution of SSTs along the equator and surface winds. And basically what you can see is sort of the time evolution of a classic El Nino event, which sort of indicates to me that Bjerknes feedback is being kicked off here. So just by forcing this model with information from the North Pacific, we're able to drive coupled interactions outside of our box down to the equator, where it can trigger ocean wave dynamics, flatten the thermocline in sort of the central eastern Pacific, and drive El Nino variability, in this case, an El Nino event. So that by itself, I think, is really neat. And then sort of the third thing to focus on is sort of this resurgence, the secondary summertime interaction, where you get a resurgence in the wind field. And we'll talk about that in more detail here in a second. But as I mentioned, it's important to compare to the uncoupled run, because then we can say whether the wind variability outside of our box is due to coupled feedbacks, or maybe it's just a downwind response to having prescribed warm SSTs, basically. So here's the uncoupled AGCM run, same Havmuller, same contours and everything. And basically what you can see is that in this one region, where I'm claiming we have WES feedback driven propagation, the model does not reproduce these winds at all. So what that says is that the winds in the coupled run are completely due to local SSTs. So that basically confirms that WES feedback is happening here in the springtime. But what is really interesting is that during the fall time, late summer, early fall, you do get sort of an uncoupled, I say that loosely, uncoupled from the local SST wind response very near to the equator. And it happens during this sort of secondary summer resurgence of the wind field downstream. So it says that on the equator, at least some of the wind variability is due to SSTs from the subtropical North Pacific. So let's analyze this in a little bit more detail. I'm going to focus in sort of a 2D sense. I'm going to focus on just August through AOS, so August through September in this box, and we're going to look at XY space. Sorry, one more thing. Why is this happening? We can look at precipitation to get sort of an idea of what's going on here as well. This is the uncoupled run, and the colored contours here are precipitation anomalies. The gray shading is the zonal mean climatological ITCZ, and this could just give us some hint as to what's going on here in the uncoupled run. Basically, what's happening, I think, here is that during the winter time, when the ITCZ is as far south as it's going to be, it's not particularly sensitive to these off-equatorial SST anomalies. But as it migrates further northward, say in the late summertime, early fall, it becomes much more sensitive to these warm SSTs, and you can see through the precipitation anomalies, you get this northward shift in the ITCZ that corresponds with sort of this downwind or downstream surface wind response near the equator. So now let's look at this in 2D space and get a better sense of what's going on. This is, again, August through October, so ASO, excuse me. This is in the uncoupled run. So this is where we restore SSTs, and everything else outside the box, there are no SST anomalies, which is why it's white. Colored contours here are precipitation anomalies. You can see that northward shift in the ITCZ. In response to the enhanced convection in the off-equatorial region, you get upper level heating, which gives you, you end up getting a gill solution to an off-equatorial heat source, basically. So you get this large cyclonic circulation response to that increased heating at height. And that large circulation extends onto the equator, driving wind variability on the equator. So at least some of this variability in the real world and in the coupled model is driven just by sort of subtropical warm North Pacific SSTs. And I should mention that again, this is happening in a model where there's nothing competing with it in the tropics. If you have really strong warm anomalies along the tropics, the ITCZ doesn't want to shift as much because you have sort of a tug of war of what's going to win. So that is one sort of caveat to all of this. In the model, though, you can see how much this is going to drive wind variability by comparing SST anomalies averaged in the subtropical box, comparing it to zonal wind anomalies averaged around the date line, where westerly wind events are thought to be important for ocean Kelvin wave generation and ultimately into dynamics. That's here, hopefully. There we go. Basically, you can see that in the model, these things are obviously positive correlated, that the warmer you have, the warmer you have subtropical SSTs, the stronger the zonal wind anomaly along the equator. And I do want to point out one particular value here, this one way up here. This is 2015, when the PMM was the largest it had ever been on record. The 2015 PMM was huge. What's interesting about this point is that if we go back and we look at our INSO time series, and we look at individual El Nino events that we're looking to reproduce, our model actually doesn't do a great job of capturing sort of the classic East Pacific El Ninos. We don't do a great job, don't do a great job of giving 72, 73, 82, 83, or 97, 98, but our model does a very nice job of capturing sort of the timing and relative magnitude of this weak 2014-15 El Nino, as well as the extreme 2015-2016 El Nino. So we can look at that in Hofmüller space just to get a sense of what's going on. This is the coupled run, 3 south to 3 north SST Hofmüller, and this is in observations. So we can see that we get the timing, onsets, and relative magnitude of the 2014-15 El Nino, and then again, the timing, relative magnitude, and actually to some extent the termination and transition to a weak La Nina here for the 2015-2016 El Nino. So why is this? Why is the model doing particularly well with this particular El Nino event? Part of the reason is because of how strong the PMM was during that preceding spring. So during that spring of 2015. If we look at this is just our composite again of the PMM's impact on the late summertime atmosphere. And this is comparing it just for 2015. It basically looks like an enhanced version of composite. And for what it's worth, I should mention that the composite doesn't really change if you remove this event. So the composite is not overly weighted by this particular event. But the point I want to make here is that the 2015 event was massive. These subtropical anomalies were something like 2.5 degrees above normal. And this would have driven a large sort of downstream atmospheric response that projects on the equator. It would have sort of pushed the distribution of random westerly wind events towards El Nino favorable. And that's sort of that's the goal of these PMMs, so to speak, is to enhance, sort of load the dice in INSTA's favor. So again, the largest PM event on record contributed, almost certainly contributed to the development of this extreme 2015-2016 El Nino. So I'd like to summarize these pacemaker results. North Pacific SSTs contribute to about 15% of observed INSO variability in boreal fall and winter. And going back to thinking about these regional mechanisms for extratropical-tropical interactions, in this case, we're not as concerned about how do high latitude energy or temperature perturbations get to the deep tropics. We're interested in how does extratropical atmospheric variability imprint on sort of the subtropics and then make its way to the deep tropics where it can influence climate, things like INSO. And it does that primarily through two physically distinct mechanisms. One is this Wes feedback propagation, and the second we're calling this summer deep convection response, this potential for the ITCZ to shift northward due to a warmer subtropical North Pacific. And this happens in the summertime because that's when the ITCZ is closest to the subtropics, and I should say boreal summertime. And it can drive as sort of a downstream, locally uncoupled wind response that enhances the likelihood of westerly wind events around the dateline. And again, if we think about individual events, the extreme 2015-16 El Nino was preceded by the largest PMM on record, which contributed to its development. So for the last 10-15 minutes of the presentation today, I'd like to show some extremely preliminary results from an analysis I'm doing of this extratropical-tropical interactions model intercomparison project, this ETIN-MIP, which is a amazing resource for the community to look at sort of these regional mechanisms in detail. It was spearheaded by Sarah Kong, who's at UNIST in South Korea, as well as a vast array of great scientists from all over the world. So this is a really great data set. I can't sing its praises more, and I'm really looking forward to sinking my teeth into it more. But I do want to treat sort of these next results as sort of more of like a group meeting, because I'm sort of interpreting them not necessarily on the fly. I've looked at these a lot, but I would be more than happy to hear people's suggestions and observations as we go through this a little bit further. So just to give you some context about what is going on in ETIN-MIP. It is a MIP, so it's a protocol for a variety of models to follow. There are 9 models, and what they do is they abruptly reduce top of the atmosphere solar insolation in high latitude bands, and these are those bands in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And they just hold that fixed, and they run the model for 150 years. It's a coupled model, so there's a fully dynamical ocean, and they output in decadal means, which is a bit of a headache, but I'm working on getting the first 20 years of data. For a variety of reasons. And then we can also compare the dynamical ocean runs to a slab ocean run to sort of diagnose air-sea interactions. But there's only one model that did a slab ocean run, and they did it for 100 years, and that was GFDL. So the goals of analyzing ETIN-MIP here are to, well, I want it to load. There we go. The goals are to, again, look at regional mechanisms and sort of in a more generalized or maybe more idealized framework of extratropical-tropical interactions, and also assess the importance of regional air-sea feedbacks in driving these signals around. And then another goal, because we have sort of a longer time series of what's going on here, I'd also like to look at sort of the fast versus slow climate response. So how does the atmosphere adjust very quickly? And then once the ocean starts to catch up, how does that influence the dynamics of what's going on? I think ETIN-MIP might be a really useful tool to look at this fast versus this transient versus more equilibrium response. So very quickly, here are the decadal mean northern hemisphere extratropical SST responses. And keep in mind that all the SST that I'm going to show you today are relative to the tropical mean. Basically, when you reduce insolation at the high latitudes, you get global cooling. But there are gradients because not everywhere cools at the same rate. There are patterns. So this is just sort of emphasizing those patterns as gradients. And you can see going from decade 1 all the way to decade 15, the large scale pattern is set really quickly. So the atmosphere adjusts on the order of maybe, really fast, like a year, maybe 2 years. So you don't see much of the atmospheric adjustment to get sort of this broad interhemispheric SST gradient. But what you do see is over time, you see a more defined sort of La Nina-like response. You also see sort of this warm, I don't want to call it a warming hole, but it's, you see this warming patch right here south of Greenland that we tend to associate with North Atlantic deep water formation as sort of the ocean begins to spin up. You also see sort of this Blues patch, which I think is interesting, as the Malvinas current extension is doing something interesting over time that you don't see in the first decade. So I'll primarily be looking at just the first decade versus the 15th decade, and there's a lot of adjustment between that. And I'll also be comparing to the 10th decade when we look at the slab ocean runs. How am I doing on time? Okay, we're doing good. So this is the same idea, but for the Southern Hemisphere experiment. I'm not going to dwell on this one too much, but I just wanted to point out the same sort of features that in the first decade, it's more of just this large-scale interhemispheric SST gradient, whereas in the last decade, you get a much more defined La Nina-like pattern here. And I should mention again that sorry, my computer cut out there. All of what I'm showing you here is the multi-model ensemble mean. So it's all 9 models averaged together. So here's the first decade and the last decade for the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere experiment with surface winds. And a couple really interesting features that I want to point out here. For example, in the first decade, you can see that the winds are purely cross-equatorial in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and you get this beautiful C-shaped bend in the winds associated with Coriolis. And this is that large-scale sort of zonal mean response of the Hadley cell circulation to move energy to the colder hemisphere. In this case, because the surface winds are cross-equatorial going southwards, that means the poleward branch, or the upper branch of the Hadley cells, is actually going towards the northern hemisphere. It's going in the opposite direction. So this is that energetic framework at play here. The atmosphere is adjusting to transmit energy from the warmer. Second, my phone is freaking out. Let me turn that off. Okay. Whereas in the last decade, something really interesting is happening between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere experiment. The Northern Hemisphere experiment is much the same. You still have that sort of large-scale cross-equatorial flow, whereas the Southern Hemisphere experiment, the winds are more divergent off the equator in the Pacific. They look much more ENSO-like, much more La Nina-like. So it's possible that those winds are actually not responding to this large-scale interhemispheric temperature gradient, but they're responding to more local SSTs, which indicates that SST feedbacks might be more important for this Southern Hemisphere experiment, potentially ocean dynamics as well. So we can look at ocean dynamics a little bit more closely. Let's see, click. Oh, here we go. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is actually just focus on the Southern Hemisphere experiment, just for brevity. Hopefully I'll follow up with a future talk someday and I'll show you guys the full results, but just I'm going to focus on the Southern Hemisphere for today, for the rest of the talk. And we'll compare to a dynamical model, which has a full depth ocean, includes ocean circulation, and compare it to a slab ocean model, which is a motionless fixed depth ocean and only includes surface flux contributions to the SST. So a comparison between these two will say something about the importance of ocean circulation in advecting heat around, basically. And what's important is that the slab ocean has coupled feedbacks, things like WES feedback as well, as does the dynamical ocean. Okay, so this is the dynamical ocean model. This is just GFDL. This is, again, the ensemble mean from all the models. I just wanted to show you that GFDL looks a lot like the ensemble mean, just not as smooth. It's just a stronger version of the ensemble mean, basically. And I want to compare the dynamical ocean model to the slab ocean model. So this is the slab response. And basically what we can see is that the slab is much more of that energetic framework. It's just the atmosphere adjusting to that interhemispheric energy gradient where you have cooler southern hemisphere and warmer northern hemisphere, and it's adjusting accordingly. The dynamical ocean model is able to do a lot more because obviously it has ocean heat transport. And as a result, the wind variability associated with that SST change is feeling something different as well. For example, in the tropical North Atlantic, you can see that the SST response is much stronger in the slab ocean, but in the dynamical ocean, it's dampened. And I'll show you a little bit later, but that dampening is due to Ekman advection, which isn't present in slab ocean models. Also, in the 10th decade here, if we look at the wind field, in the slab, you get that cross-equatorial wind that is much more related to that zonal mean energetic framework, whereas in the dynamical ocean, you get that divergent flow that looks a lot more like La Nina, and it seems to be due to the importance of having ocean circulation. And one other thing I wanted to point out is just sort of the latitudinal extent of the coldest anomalies in this case. In the slab, the temperature anomalies are able to extend much further equatorward in this case. So that also suggests that ocean circulation is sort of dampening the extent to which these anomalies can escape the high latitudes. So I want to focus on the Atlantic just sort of as a region to sort of illustrate the power of this tool. Again, this is all preliminary. I haven't quite analyzed it in depth, but I wanted to just give you a sense of the direction we're going with this. So we're going to compare the first decade, and we have to the last decade, and we can look at turbulent fluxes, radiation, in this case, Ekman advection, and we can calculate everything else that's going on in the ocean as a residual. And this is, again, back in the multi-model mean sense. So blue here is a cooling, and red is a warming. And we can look at that as well in the last decade. So a couple things to point out is that in the first decade, you can see this nice cross-equatorial wind field again, and you get a meridional dipole, in this case of the turbulent heat fluxes, that are helping to maintain this cross-equatorial SST gradient. So again, Wes feedback is effective in maintaining, in a quasi-equilibrium sense, cross-equatorial SST gradients. But because we have a dynamical ocean, it's dampened by Ekman advection. So this is actually a well-known thing, that Ekman advection dampens the tropical response to high latitude forcing in this case. So it would be stronger, and that's why it's stronger in the slab. One other thing I want to point out is the increased role for net radiation. You can see that you get broad cooling due to radiation changes throughout the tropics, which is helping to sort of dampen, it accentuates the anomalies in the South Atlantic, but it dampens them in the North Atlantic. So we can look at why that is. I said all this, but we can look at why that is by breaking down the radiation into its individual terms. A couple things to highlight. If we look at, say, the shortwave, this is just the net shortwave, downward shortwave, clear sky, cloudy. This is the net down minus net clear. So this gives you the effects of things like low clouds. You can see that as you cool the South Atlantic, you increase marine stratocumulus, basically. You increase low cloud fraction, which reduces shortwave. So this is evidence, again, of low cloud SST feedback. This seems like it's an important regional air-sea interaction that maintains some of these SST anomalies in the Southeast Atlantic. Another thing that is really interesting is this broad cooling from downward long wave. And this looks a lot like water vapor feedback, where if you cool the world basically uniformly, well, not uniformly, there are patterns, but if you cool the tropics, you reduce the amount of moisture in the water column from Clausius Clapeyron, which reduces downward long wave radiation. So that is another cooling effect throughout the tropics, is this water vapor feedback. And then again, the effect of clouds is pretty evident in both the cloudy shortwave and the cloudy long wave as well. So with that, I think I'm out of time. Well, start. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. I'll just summarize here. Ocean circulation, it seems to be important in dampening tropical SST responses through Ekman advection. Air-sea interactions are certainly important early through getting the signal down into the deep tropics. I think if I look at the first 20 years of each of these model simulations, I might see more evidence of, say, that first component of Wes feedback, that propagating component, as being important. But Wes feedback is certainly important in maintaining these tropical SST gradients. And then the tropical ocean circulation seems to be more important in the Southern Hemisphere experiment and less important in the Northern Hemisphere experiment later on. In the next steps, again, I'd like to isolate sort of that quick response in the first 20 years, which I'm getting that data soon. And then we're also running some AMIP simulations to determine the local effect of SST versus sort of that large scale interhemispheric SST effect on the wind field, just to again see if air-sea interactions are important and where regionally they are important. All right, so with that, here are just some literature that came mostly out of my PhD that can help further explain what I discussed in the first part of the talk. We're working on ETN-MIP results, and I'm hoping to write that up in the coming months, and I'm happy to chat with anybody who has any comments or questions about it. So with that, I will take any questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot for an excellent talk. So if you have any questions, raise your hands. Okay, we've already got some. Jerry, I will unmute you.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for the nice talk, Dylan. I was just curious about this ETIN-MIP. How do they decide what latitudes they put in the, where they cut off the incoming solar?
It's a good question. Truth be told, I'm not 100% sure. That Kong et al. Paper, that 2020 paper, is a BAMS paper where they summarize all of the ETIN-MIP modeling framework. I can't remember their justification, to be honest with you. I'm sure they had a good reason. I know that historically people have cut it off at like 60 to 45, something like that. But I think that paper would have the explanation.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Clara?
Yes, thanks, Dylan. Such a good talk. I wanted to come back to your PMM results.
Mm-hmm.
I was just interested in your thoughts about future changes, possible changes in PMM strength and or polarity with global warming. And if there might be...
Yeah, that's a great question.
Let me just finish. And if there might be then some reason to investigate whether, models, projections of changes in ENSO variance and in the relative proportion of Central Pacific events, whether that might be tied to future changes in the PMM.
That is a very good question. I know people have looked at how thermodynamically how WES feedback will change in a warmer world, and the summary of it. And that's what I was trying to get to here on the extra slides. I'm wondering if I have. It doesn't look like I have it. But if you look at like the WES parameter, which is like the change in latent heat flux for a given change in zonal wind anomaly, that increases under global warming. For good thermodynamic reasons. So people have argued that the PMM will become an increasingly important part of ENSO under global warming. What people haven't done, that I've seen at least, is taken the step that you've just taken, which is really interesting, that sort of the projected increase in CP ENSO versus EP ENSO could be due to this effect. I don't know. That's an excellent question.
Thanks.
And Haiyan?
My question is about the, first, thank you for the nice talk, Dylan. And I'm wondering about your formula diagram, and I'm wondering why it takes 9 months for the signals to propagate to the, you kind of hinted that the SST anomalies propagate to the equator. But I am wondering, since it looks like the wind anomalies started to appear in May, earlier than the SST, whether the wind anomalies are caused by just remote response to the heating associated with the PMM, or it is really SST anomalies propagating to the equator.
Okay, you cut out just a little bit, but I think I understood the gist of your question. If I don't answer it, let me know and I'll try again. I just want to get ahead to this plot here. So you're wondering why we get wind anomalies as early as May if the SST anomalies are here. They don't arrive until later. Is that what your question was?
Yeah, I am wondering what because the WES feedback can happen really fast. It doesn't need to take months for.
Yeah, I think basically what's happening here, and comparing to the uncoupled run is useful. The wind anomalies here are being generated by, I can't say for sure exactly which SSTs, but my hunch is that they're being driven by the warm SST anomalies that are at higher sort of subtropical latitudes. So this is still sort of that WES feedback component, where if you remember from the schematic, we just had that lobe of warm anomalies, and that's what's going on here. And these winds are being driven in across the equator by this warmth here. And it's not this warmth up here, because you don't get it in the uncoupled run. You don't get any of these winds in the uncoupled run. So I think these winds have to be responding to SSTs that are not being restored by the model. They have to be from SSTs that are on this side of the dashed line. And my hunch is that they're coming from the warmth that is here, which is WES driven. So I do think that the wind anomalies around the date line are totally consistent with with WES feedback, but the SST signal just takes some time to get down there in this sort of composite sense. But I agree with you that WES feedback driven propagation doesn't necessarily take, in this case it goes from about March till about July. So it doesn't take however long that is, 4 months. In reality, it could take a month or maybe a couple of weeks. I'm not sure. It is a much faster process than this, what this implies.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so next we have Cecile Panland.
There we are. I have a comment and a question. I really think you've done a lovely job of showing how the WES mechanism accounts for the upper branch of the optimal structure that Prashant and I found in '95. But there was a lower branch too to that optimal structure. And I'm wondering if that's when the negative branch of the PMM is somewhat interrupted. And I would call your attention to the other oceans, in particular during 2014-15, there was a very strong contribution from the Bermuda High, which made that negative part of the PMM much stronger, but it interrupted the development of the El Nino during that section. Also, there's a huge Rossby wave response in the southern hemisphere that can affect the trade winds in the southern tropical Pacific in the east. And I just want to call your attention to the other half of the optimal structure that is not explained by your mechanism. But the question I have is about the multi-model ensembles, just uniform bias, negative bias of the SST in the Western Pacific. And according to your results, could that be due to overly strong Ekman pumping?
Are you referring to ETIN-MIP?
Yes.
I mean, the short answer is I'm not sure. I'd have to look. That is a good question. It might be one way to, I'm not sure. I guess my point is that I'm not sure that ETIN-MIP is the framework to diagnose that particular problem because they are being perturbed in a weird way. I think maybe if you had a MIP of just control simulations, that might be the best way. That would be the way I would go about answering that question, is if I was going after it, was to get some unperturbed simulations. But I'm not sure about the Ekman bias. And I just want to respond to your comment about the southern lobe. I totally agree that the southern, sort of the cooling half of the meridional mode is important. But I guess historically people have not focused on it as much because most of the meridional mode work initially was in the Atlantic. And when they focused on sort of that southern lobe versus northern lobe, they found that southern lobe can be often statistically independent of that northern lobe, which is a little confusing given the coupling between that northern hemisphere warming and the southern hemisphere cooling. But I guess my point is that the southern hemisphere lobe can also have a mind of its own, which makes it harder to sort of look at the large scale dynamics relative to that northern lobe. But that is a good point to sort of keep both of those in mind.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Sally?
Hi, Dillon. Nice talk. I'm just wondering, for the ETIN-MIP, you mentioned cloud changes. Do you have an idea of what's driving the cloud changes? Is it like SST only, or it's the stability or advection?
Again, good question. My guess is that it's local SST, and our AMIP simulations that we have running right now, where we're forcing an atmospheric model with the multi-model ensemble mean SST. That will be able to tell us if local SST is important. Basically, if we can see the same low cloud changes in the AMIP simulation as we do in the dynamical model, that'll be one way to sort of diagnose that. But my hunch is local SST is important.
Okay, cool, thanks.
And then Clara?
Okay, this is about the ETIN-MIP. So I wanted to respond to Jerry's question about, so why those idealized solar constant perturbations were placed at such high latitudes. I think one motivation actually came from the work that Jen Kay had done on showing the sensitivity to Southern Ocean cloud SST interactions, and how in the presence of ocean dynamics, you can actually get a tropical response. So I think that was one motivating factor for why those perturbations were placed at such high latitudes. But my question, Dillon, for the ETIMIP, the slide that had the Northern Hemisphere experiment with the first and last decade. Yeah, just the first and last decade with the wind field on it.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I was really interested, the lower left plot, the last decade for the Northern Hemisphere experiment, that the wind changes, the easterly wind anomalies over the Southern Ocean are so prominent and probably help to cause that warming over the Southern Ocean. And obviously they're not present in the first decade. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about what might be producing that response.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you guys can see my cursor, I hope. I think the easterlies here might be associated with this sort of broad, I guess it's cyclonic circulation in the Southern Hemisphere. And I'm wondering, I'm sort of interpreting this on the fly here, but I'm wondering if that might be related to the PSA. So maybe this La Nina-like pattern is driving some sort of standing teleconnection that is driving the circulation response. But it is also associated with like a broad zonally uniform easterly change. So it could be related to, I think you and I had looked at the zonal stream function, the mass stream function, and the Ferrel cell is weakened in the opposite hemisphere. So in the Southern Hemisphere, the Ferrel cell is weakened. So that would also weaken the westerlies in the Southern Ocean. So that it could be related to some eddy dynamics. I'm not sure.
Well, it's very interesting, right? To have such a prominent signal at high latitudes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, in the Southern Hemisphere experiment, it's kind of hard to see because the arrows are black, but you do get an increase in the westerlies. I would say a marked increase, even though the forcing is in the Southern Hemisphere, you still get a strong surface wind response. Whereas in the Northern Hemisphere case, again, it's hard to see, but the winds they're really not that strong relative to the opposite case. But you do see the opposite hemisphere wind response for sure.
Thanks.
Right. Well, we're just a little afternoon now, so I guess we'll leave it there unless anyone has any other burning questions. Thanks, Dillon, for a great talk. And so we'll see you all again next week. We have Alison Wing from FSU is going to talk about convective aggregation and climate sensitivity next Tuesday. So have a good week, and thanks again, Dillon.
No problem. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.